are live on Building in Public with George Zeng for, I think, visit number 2 as the official guest, right?
Yes, yes. Last
Welcome
time
back.
we chatted about a bunch of stuff around Thrashio and other ecom aggregators, which was fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we don't have to get right into the meat, though. We can. You were asking where we are right now, and we were going to ask you the same. So we can all give a little location update. I'm still in San Francisco right now, but we are headed to Mammoth Lakes. Well, actually, we're going to stop over in Auburn for Memorial Day weekend, and then we'll be in Mammoth Lakes for most of June.
Fantastic. Misty, where are you?
Yeah. I'm still on Oahu, but I'm on the North Shore now. Moved here in April.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. As you guys probably know, my wife and I have been bouncing around all over the place. We were San Francisco area, then we were in Boston, then we were in Oahu for like a month or so, where we missed Misty.
Yeah.
Then we came back to Boston and got our shots, so we're fully vaccinated now. Thank God.
Nice.
And we're coming back to the Bay Area for like 20 days or so in about a week or 2 weeks or so.
Mm-hmm.
And then God knows from there. We've just been bouncing around all over the place.
What sort of criteria do you use when deciding what's next?
Yeah. We wanted to be in a place that's essentially like close to time zone wise PST, because that's where most of my team, most of Nancy's team is. And then we've wanted to go places where it may be difficult to do if we didn't have a pandemic going on. Like Boston was nice because we got to spend time with family, right? And no other year would we be able to spend essentially like 8 months worth of time with family, so, or like Hawaii, right? It's like rare to otherwise get a month of time to spend in Hawaii. Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just been on places where we can do really, really unique stuff, see people that we care about, or have experiences we otherwise wouldn't be able to have.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like kind of Western United States, maybe for the time zone reason, might be coming up next. Do you feel like, are you more mountain town or beach side, or do you have any kind of climate preferences, or what might drive, because you still have like a lot of flexibility, it sounds like, with your your situation.
Yeah, I'm a beach dude all the way. If I could.
All the way. Okay.
I'm a surfer who doesn't know how to surf. That was like my one regret of not having learned how to surf while we were in Hawaii.
Oh, you should go to SoCal and learn.
Yeah, I do want to do that really bad. It's maybe in SoCal, maybe in Hawaii. Some point in time, I just want to be able to learn how to pick up a surfboard.
Yeah, It's super fun. That's what I've been doing, that every day for like 2 months. Just getting thrashed, but it's so fun.
What about you guys? Talk to me. How are things with Highlighter?
They're good. We've been, I think last time you were on, it was officially called Lunch Break, and now it is called Building in Public. So both, nothing has changed, but everything has changed. What I mean by that is we've gotten a lot more focused on really talking to people specifically about stuff they're building, and a little bit less of I'd say maybe the purview was more general. Like sometimes Misty and I would hang out and read Twitter and share links together. And that was kind of, lunch break. That was like a successful lunch break if we, surfaced new ideas and tagged people in and stuff. And I think now we've gotten a lot more focused on kind of the format of let's interview people who are making things and building things in the world. And so that is, it may sound similar, but I think it actually has changed in character to be more focused. And then I think a kind of a outgrowth of that is that I think we're realizing that because we're kind of this live format, and we don't have like a lot, we don't need a lot of preparation, and we don't need scriptedness, the highlights themselves grab the best moments. So instead of saying like, let's do a formal structured podcast with somebody who's building something that's already well known or that's already out in the world, the live format and the highlight nature of it, I think allows us to move toward the more raw things that, they probably have never talked about what they are or what they're even thinking about or working on. And so it actually has this really nice property of like the kind of raw, almost like when you're meeting a new company as a pre-seed angel investor or kind of a, even just a brainstorm buddy. We kind of have, I think, the right, kind of a unique place to do that type of thing. And it's stuff we like to do, and our networks around us are, a lot of those kinds of types of people. So that started to feel, I think we feel a lot of pull and energy in that direction. But I wonder when we say that, what's kind of your reaction to that idea?
My reaction is very positive, right? I think, and then this is something that I think we've chatted about before, DK, and I'm actually very thankful. I think you're a fantastic brainstorm buddy, and we've been brainstorming stuff for years. Right.
Right.
and then with Misty as well. Now that we've gotten to know each other a little bit better in the last year, but like DK, you and I have been brainstorming stuff for I don't even know how many years at this point. Like
right.
4 years, 3-4 years, something like that. Right?
Yeah.
And it's just a ton of fun brainstorming stuff, right? So I think that kind of like joy and pleasure comes across in conversations with you and probably on these video sessions as well. It's also super interesting because I think this addresses some of the weaknesses that, exist on something like Clubhouse, right? There's like this other startup that launched. Have you heard of Racket before? Played around with the product?
Oh, I saw it.
Yeah.
Have you been using that?
So I've played around with it a bit, right? Like it seems like they're trying to merge some of what happens with the spontaneity of Clubhouse with like a better historical record of what happens in conversation. And that to me seems pretty powerful because you're able to actually open up and index like all of the conversations that have happened before. And kind of what we're doing with like, building public or lunch break, in my mind, enables that same kind of both spontaneity, the indexing, the search, and then being able to add a video component to it, I think is also really nice and really powerful as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think there is something about having the record of what happened that is, everything we've done has been doubled down on like creating that record of what happened. I think a lot of that is because, it was what we were trying to do already when we started building this product. We were doing this with Zoom and trying to publish it to YouTube. And so kind of the recorded nature was kind of a default of what we were trying to accomplish. But I think we're also finding that having a record is nice because it lets us, we were talking to, I don't know if you know Varun Gupta.
I don't actually.
From Caffeinated Capital. He works with Ray Tonsing on Caffeinated.
Ah, cool.
And he was on yesterday, and we were talking about how oftentimes, like the very first discussion he's having with somebody, he's trying to sort of get the vibe of the person, and some of those types of discussions could be, they're not necessarily unique to his discussion with that person. So we were saying, like, could we do the like first level interview, create the thing, we pull out the vibe from somebody, and we're able to sort of showcase that, and then we can share it to Varun or George or Ray or whoever might want to sort of see that. And then if they're like, oh, I love the vibe of this and I like the topic and I'm going to meet this person, then they can go off and, do their process. But maybe it can save the whole ecosystem a little bit of kind of the, almost, can we short circuit some of the first meetings to get the first meetings for those people to be deeper because they've already kind of understand the person's story, the twists and turns, what motivates them, how they approach the problem, what the general problem space is. So that's some of the stuff that we heard from Varun that kind of excited us too.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is super, super powerful is I think a lot of like essentially products rhyme with each other and are based on like sort of underlying kind of like common human characteristics, common human sort of psychology, motivations and whatnot, right? There's been, I'm sure you've seen them as well, a bunch of products that have popped up post-COVID that have like this video and interaction component to them and community component to them. And to me, they always feel like there's like there are clear analogies to what happened in the physical world, right? Some of the products I've used recently, including like Icebreaker, which is now gathered around, Hopin, Circle.so, I think, Run the World, a whole bunch of these as well, right? And there's like this aspect of this where it enables like video interactions in like different ways that's very, very powerful. But kind of what I also think I analogize with like the analog world is they remind me of like taking bits and pieces of what exists with a meetup, right? Like .com. And they've like digitized the actual interaction components of it, right? And then there's a separate set of products that like essentially digitize the community aspect of it, right? But I think the two are tied in super, super closely together, right?
Right.
If you essentially go off on a limb, you can think of a world where you enable something like these like conversations to happen. But dude, when these conversations finish and we lose the connections that we have on this interaction, and it's outsourced to a third-party platform like YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, it's like that's a loss, right? Yeah. If you could have both the meetup kind of like community element to it, as well as the technical infrastructure to enable those meetups and communities to actually like hang out and jam and have these sessions, that in itself feels like a product that's so much more powerful.
Right. I guess there's a lot of people who are kind of taking different approaches to this broad idea that you're describing. And I think I'd maybe categorize them as it maybe at least two major buckets. One is more like the show, and one is more like the meetup, kind of the mingling or the lobby part. And I think there's people who are kind of a little bit in each, and some who are more in one or more in the other. So do you feel like does that seem like the right way to categorize the world? And if so, do you have any sort of beliefs, given everything you've seen and all the experiences you've had online or meetup or otherwise, but do you have a set of core beliefs around like the thin wedge starting point that's going to really kind of unlock the space and create a lot of value for people? Is that going to be kind of more in the show running or more in the community assembly?
Yeah. Now I'm just talking off the top of my dome.
Perfect.
For a second. You guys are definitely experts here because I haven't sort of thought too deeply about this. Only as like as a enjoyer of like thinking about products and like builder of products, right? Kind of what I suspect for a lot of these essentially interaction tools where you can do a video session or whatnot. I actually think they will over time end up getting commoditized.
Yeah.
Right? Because essentially what ends up happening is it's the same tools. Right. Packaged in slightly different ways. Maybe you have a different UI and whatnot. Right. I think maybe be able to get, further ahead or behind based on like, how aggressive you are in terms of product innovation as well as your GTM. But it ends up feeling like thinner ground to stand on. But I think the community aspect of it, if you really, really nail it down, is a lot more powerful. I think the moats are a lot thicker. If you've ever tried to rip a community from a native platform and move it to another platform, it doesn't work.
Right.
It's like, at least from what I've seen, really hard to work. I've seen some people try to rip Facebook communities off of Facebook into another platform. I've generally seen that to be like very, very difficult to do.
Were they doing it with a specific new value prop, or was it just that the organizer of the community wanted it off of Facebook?
Organizer, right? They're like,
okay, yeah,
hey, I want to be able to monetize this community better or do something better with this community.
Right.
Facebook is where it is right now, and I'm limited in my options. Let me rip it off and put it on like a Discord community or something.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I think if you're going to move a community, I agree that whatever tooling and original assembly that a community kind of is created around is like incredibly sticky for that community. I don't know that I'd be so pessimistic that a community could move from one place to another, but I think it has to be not in service of the organizer's desire, but it has to be in service of like the community's needs. Yeah. So if it's like there's a new feature or some sort of way to get deeper on a product feature or vertical need that community has that's otherwise underserved, then it seems like, okay, you'll be able to move this community because they assembled here, but it's actually better in this new place versus like the organizer's like, oh, I can't really make money here and I can make money here in this other place, so let's move.
Yeah. I also suspect what ends up happening is like when you build a product, they tell you to, in order to acquire users, go to where the users hang out. Right? If you end up building community on Facebook, like where the community naturally hangs out is on Facebook.
Right.
If you rip them off and put it on a different platform, you might have acquired a community of people that just naturally don't use that other platform as well. Whereas they check Facebook every day, and if they see a notification from one of the groups they're in, they're like much more likely to essentially be taken back into that community.
Right. But I think there are examples, and this may not be quite the right nature of a community, but like examples where people transition from one product with strong behaviors to another. I think there's plenty of examples of that kind of thing, though, the ones I'm about to propose are not really in the community sense. It's more like in the utility, but there's just like a place where people hang out. So I think, obvious, easy, often quoted example might be something like Airbnb and the way that they use Craigslist, because it wasn't just another place to list it, but it was like the listing had like different features and better photos. And like there were a lot of things about the listing that actually made it like, okay, you do this here and it's good. But if you come to this other place, it's actually deeply serves this specific need. Instead of the same place you could sell appliances, find an apartment, rent, borrow a bike, or, meet people for dating, right? Which like Craigslist kind of very, very horizontal in that way.
Yeah.
And then another one I think of like, do you know StubHub, where you can buy tickets?
Yeah.
So StubHub, like you could argue that behavior, that behavior was happening on eBay, but was really hard to do on eBay because there's a lot of structured information that you want to be able to search on. Like the date range of the tickets matters a lot. And the city of the tickets matters a lot. In the actual structure of like a generalized listing doesn't always take as much account of those. And so I think the StubHub opportunity emerged despite eBay kind of solving the problem. It like deeply underserved the problem relative to what StubHub created. Yeah. So I think there's categories like that. Now neither of those are really community examples, but I believe that like you could find the same pattern in a community that assembles on Facebook, but actually needs, some sort of transactional commerce-y thing that Facebook doesn't natively support, like a Kickstarter like thing. You could probably imagine maybe they probably have crowdfunding today on Facebook, but you can imagine like other types of vertical features that are underserved in the kind of existing infrastructure.
That's fair. I think like rolling off of another platform is a really smart thing to do. And then one of the, tried and true playbooks in entrepreneurship is take a horizontal platform, pick an attractive vertical, build a vertical specific version of that product with features that are a lot better for that vertical, right? And the experience just ends up being so much better that you can siphon traffic from the existing original platform as well.
Yeah. What's the most modern example of this that we can think of? Because I feel like the ones I quoted reach over 10 years, maybe too often quoted. But is there anything more recent that kind of showcases this?
Yeah. Dude, I feel like I see examples of this all the time. So one of the examples that I've seen recently is there is this e-commerce startup called Whatnot, started by Facebookers. They built a marketplace for collectibles with like video as like the core feature, differentiating features, right? And if you think back to the history of eBay started out with collectibles Pez dispensers, right? Yep. So it feels coming back full circle on the origin story of a platform to go back to that initial focus vertical, right? Yep. And there are a bunch of Facebookers who are talking about building a college-only version social network,
right? Yeah,
where you're essentially constrained if you didn't go to that college by email address, and that was what Facebook was originally. Right.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting. It kind of reminds me of was it Nathan Bashez who wrote about how products, I think he did within the context of Webflow, but he was talking about how products start very simple and then they kind of move up market and serve bigger audiences, bigger dollar amounts, but then in doing so they lose the kind of starting point, and that kind of opens up potential gaps for like lower monetized, maybe lower overall volume, but sometimes like, tremendously more passion or kind of, better distribution mechanics or, so because it kind of is underserved.
Yeah. I think you could probably refresh a lot of like horizontal platforms with a vertical focus every 10, 15 years, right? It's like that old quote, there's two ways to make money. One is to, what was it? One is to
bundling and unbundling.
Unbundling.
Yeah. I think it's Barksdale. Yeah.
Yeah, Barksdale. But if you go back to kind of like, these platforms that are creating essentially video products and community-based products, which are, I agree with the general sort of bucketing of that. The thing that's super interesting as well is you're able to actually use the video-based infrastructure to actually build moats even for a community, as long as you save the content, index it, and work for the future, right? Because the content itself becomes part of the moat.
Yep. Yeah. So, I'm thinking out loud about this. I know Whatnot in a very high level is kind of a live shopping experience. And I think Pop Shop Live is another one in that category. My understanding of those services is that it's more like enabling a new type of seller. But I wonder, are there live experiences that could be built around existing sellers and helping them just sell through a live channel? So I'm imagining could you take a bunch of Shopify merchants and create a stage to help them, tell their story, explain their product, and sell their product directly? Like, have we seen something like that, or will that end up in one of these existing kind of emergent live shopping platforms? Or how do you think about that?
It's a good question. I think that different sort of tools will end up manifesting themselves in different ways depending on whether there are things that need essentially critical mass to hit or not, right? So let's step back for a second. Let's talk about live streaming e-commerce. Kind of what I think will actually happen over time with live streaming e-commerce will be that it will end up being it will end up being a commoditized product feature that everyone has, right? Mm-hmm. The same as let's say email updates, right? Like email drip campaigns. Basically, every single e-commerce platform or product has email drip campaigns. I think things like video and live video will end up going that way and end up being embedded in more and more e-commerce products in the future, right? Mm-hmm. Until that's the point in time, there may be a window where you can essentially build a platform with that as the main distinguishing feature, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that will probably be the case. I think what you'll probably end up seeing with a bunch of these platforms that exist right now is the platforms that specialize on a limited time, limited inventory item will get more transactions happening on that platform than a commoditized platform.
Right.
Commoditized product. Right. So in that specific example of Whatnot or Pop Shop Live, I think Whatnot will do better than Pop Shop Live.
I don't know a lot about either of the platforms. I only know the high level banner. So what are the main distinctions?
Yeah. One is that Whatnot seems to really focus on collectibles, right? So collectibles are like a limited inventory kind of item. It almost ends up being like a dropped kind of item, right? Whereas I think what Pop Shop Live is doing, and I haven't looked at these companies closely in the last few months, but I think what Pop Shop Live is doing is it's going across a horizontal focus to any kind of merchant that wants to onboard onto the platform, right? Mm-hmm. I think that leads to horizontal expansion. It will probably lead to a situation where you have people who will tune into live streams, but the rate of transactions will probably be less than what it is on Whatnot. And if the primary monetization lever is actually transactions, Whatnot will probably make more per session than Pop Shop Live will. Mm-hmm. So I think the transaction bit will be interesting. To your original question about how the sort of live shopping format, I think that there's a moment in time when you can probably build a platform around this feature, but over time, as is what happened in Asia, live video just ends up being like an additional feature you use as part of your e-commerce toolkit.
But presumably over time, if you get out of the gate early with something, you end up aggregating audience and credit card on file and data about people's interests or what kinds of stuff they participate in. So you can improve the experience over time, even though the video component, live video is a commodity, but the audience and interests and credit card tie may be more proprietary, some of them.
How did it work in Asia? Did the ones that started off with live video sort of just broaden, or were they did they become obsolete because other people started integrating live video?
Yeah, Asia's a little bit funky. What ended up happening was there wasn't, for a lot of different products, it didn't end up being one feature. that tipped him over, right? There are really 4 or 5 features sort of blurred in together, right? One was live video. Another was actually social group buying, social e-commerce. Folks like PDD really, really did a good job here. Third is like gamification. There are a lot of products in Asia that actually have like a super strong gaming component to them, which is pretty interesting. Like, haven't really seen that in a big way in the West, at least. Fourth is some version of like membership as well baked in, right? So there's this company in China called Yunji. It is one of the few e-commerce company that ended up actually being listed in the US. But they're e-commerce plus membership, kind of like a Costco plus MLM, like at the same time, right? And then what ends up happening, and then influencers also ends up being an important part of the equation for a lot of the Chinese e-commerce ecosystem. So you have like these 4 or 5 features that ended up being utilized to differing degrees for different apps. And I wouldn't say like what made or break the successful apps was any one of these features. It was the essentially amalgamation of several of these features in context of things like community that ended up really, really cracking the market for them.
You mentioned kind of the membership and Costco thing. I don't know if this is true. I'm not a deep student of Costco, but I've heard it thrown around that Costco, kind of breaks even on all of the sales, and they only really make margin or anything net on the membership. Is that true to your understanding?
That's true to my understanding, right?
Okay.
And then there are folks who are trying to do some version of that in the U.S. as well. There's this guy named Jeremy Tai from Italic who's trying to do some version of that for online memberships as well.
I was going to mention Italic, yeah, because I don't know if you've played Misty. Have you seen this one?
I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it. So you can have a membership.
Cool.
It's like more designer focused, or
yeah, it's kind of. I guess I'm clicking here. It says luxury goods is sort of the kind of thing. But what I've noticed is they have, I think it's a membership model, but then they have sourced things from similar manufacturers to some original. Maybe it's an original, I don't know, an Aeron chair or something, and then they have like the same manufacturer, but they sell it for 50% the cost, or maybe even less sometimes. And so they're giving probably like they're taking like no retail margin presumably on those types of things. They're buying them from the same wholesalers, and they're passing all the retail as value to the consumer, and then they're only making their cut on the membership piece.
Yeah,
and it's different than Costco, but it's more like kind of these like luxury goods instead of kind of the more commodity goods that you might expect to find at Costco. So it kind of starts with a different market segment.
Yeah, different market segment, different type of products, right? People use Costco a lot for like groceries or like a lot of different things you use every week, right? It's super interesting as well. Jeremy did like I've jammed with him a few times, like last year, I think. But he recently did a podcast, I think, on one of the Invest Like the Best or something, one of those podcasts. And he ended up really talking about how deeply they got into actually logistics and supply chain. I didn't realize that before, but that seems to also be an important part of their strategy as well.
Yeah, I guess you've got to have great relationships with manufacturers, and even figuring out which are the right manufacturers to spend your time with. There's a whole kind of quality question to that. I mean, you look at this says compared to Diptyque, is that the right way to say that? Compared to Diptyque, which is $68, and they've got this thing for like $16, so kind of in the range of a quarter of the price, so 75% off. And it looks beautiful. It looks like probably a high-end kind of candle, but not a high-end price at all.
Yeah. And this is I just posted the podcast that he did with I think the dude from Invest Like the Best, and
cool.
super interesting podcast. What I didn't realize is they also did a lot of pricing tests, A/B tests, and what they found was that 50% or so was when they essentially could get to a tipping point for when people would be willing to pay for an annual type subscription and like the Costco type features. So, I think Jeremy and the Italic folks are doing some pretty interesting stuff.
Cool. And did you connect with him originally around Italic, or it was something else he was working on?
We were just jamming about social e-commerce in general, because we also have some of the same friends in the Chinese e-commerce ecosystem. So
Right.
we actually met through some of those friends.
Oh, cool. So yeah, with speaking of which, I'd love to sort of hear the latest with kind of your thinking. And I was thinking, I forget exactly all of what we wrapped with last time, so we may have had some loose ends. I don't know if either of you remember any loose ends, but I thought it might be interesting to kind of hear, more about sort of how you think about your process so far, because like you said, I mean, we were jamming on stuff, what was it, 4 years ago? And, we were very excited about like the KYC idea. And, I'm just curious, like how has your path looked, and how have you decided when it's time to stop pursuing? And do you ever look back and say, oh, I wanted to learn a little bit more about this, maybe I should have given it a little more time? Or do you feel like, wow, we spent too much time on that thing? And so just, I'm almost curious about like kind of that narrative of what got you to where you are today. And then we can talk about where you are today and however much, you're comfortable sharing about your ideas around the future.
Yeah. So if I look at the heart of like what you're talking about, I think you're talking about like the process of ideation.
Mm-hmm.
What was the process of ideation like? It's super interesting because like I've tried to also divine that across many of our friends who founded companies, right? And it's really easy to retroactively go back and tell a narrative about how everything took place, right? And the truth is a lot messier than that. And then, there's been some instances of where people have talked about how messy the process is. And the other thing I pair with this idea is one of the things I've come to believe in the startup world is like almost every startup is a singularity in itself.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to abstract patterns across too many startups, other than like a few very basic things, you want to have good people, you want it to be a big opportunity, you want to build great products. It's important to be thoughtful about GTM and things like that.
Yeah.
But almost every other rule that people try to come out from, I've seen basically be broken. Right. So on ideation, people have all of these theories about like, hey, what you should do is you should be a personal sort of like person that's actually experienced a problem before. Right. Some people are big advocates of that. PG has this whole thing where he's like, hey, you should be on the cusp of the future, because if you are on the cusp of the future, you kind of like see further and then build what you need, right? I know personally I'm a super analytical person, right? So kind of what myself and my co-founder Craig ended up doing is actually like a very, very structured, spreadsheet evaluation of the different things we were thinking about, one by one, looking at the idea, what is the differentiated secret we believe we know, understanding like our best guess of the TAM, SAM, SOM, go-to-market channels, how easy is it to build and sort of scale, like all of these kind of questions in a very structured way. But that's just an output of like how I think, right? And then DK, as you know, because we ran a lot of these spreadsheets by you, we ran them just by like friends and trusted people who we knew were really good at startups, at product, at growth, who've seen a lot of different data points and got their sort of input, right? So we had both this like analytical and qualitative component to it. And then the real, to really put this to the test, we actually built MVPs of a bunch of them and like actually put them out in market and sort of saw what the market for them were, right? So our process is a lot more structured, analytical, built in with qualitative and experimentation. And, to put a much more successful example of like an entrepreneur who did this, to a certain extent, this is what also Jeff Bezos did with Amazon as well, right? He did like basically a spreadsheet of things that he thought could be successful in terms of selling on the internet. And his eventual conclusion was that something that has high SKU count, like books, is the ideal kind of thing to sell on the internet. Right. And then there are other examples, as we know, there are like folks like Keith Raboy who've essentially incubated ideas with founders who've, where he basically, my sense is like, had a strong component of giving that idea to the founder. And then amongst our friends like Avichal, Alad, other folks as well, there are many examples of like, this cohort of like really thoughtful pre-seed folks helping to essentially give or seed the initial idea behind a lot of really powerful companies, right? So ideation, my conclusion is that it's like almost a singularity event in itself. There's a lot of different ways to come to good ideas that end up working to become like great startups. Some of it's quantitative, some of it's qualitative, but the most important component probably is just like surrounding yourself with good people.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And the quantitative and qualitative aspects of this will just evolve organically.
Yeah. What was the process of like building those MVPs? Like, I mean, how deep did you go in them? And I don't know. I'm super curious about what you did once you decided there were a couple things you wanted to play around with.
Yeah. What we ended up doing is we ended up actually devising different MVPs for different kinds of products in different verticals. And I think this has to be a highly bespoke process, right? So we're looking at stuff in cybersecurity. And our cybersecurity MVP was putting together a sales deck and trying to convince a CISO that they need to buy this. Right. That was the MVP, right?
Yeah.
For something that was like consumer facing, what we ended up doing is like building a landing page or an unbound splash page, running Facebook ads, and then trying to run them as far down the funnel as you possibly can. Right. And then it's really important to run as far down the funnel as you can because, you know, every step down the funnel is like essentially like order of magnitude greater fidelity. And then just we took very, very different approaches for very, very different ideas.
That's cool. Are there were there certain approaches that you found gave more signal than others? Like what would you or do you think they were all good just for their specific domain?
Yeah. I think B2B you want to essentially like close a contract if you can. That's kind of like the bar in my mind, right?
Yeah.
And if you're able to close contracts and get people willing to pay for something, awesome. Go and build it. Right?
Yeah.
B2C, I think, has to be more product driven. Right? You want to build something that gives an approximation of that product. And again, as far down the conversion funnel as you can. Right? You want to go as far down the conversion funnel as you can. If you can essentially pre-sell people on a product before you build it in the B2C world, you want to do that as well. Right? But sometimes it's more difficult to do that than to, you know, get a CISO at least verbally commit to doing something or like, you know, signing an LOI, right? So it's probably two general ballparks of different approaches for B2B versus B2C.
I wonder kind of in the specific, you know, how, you know, I think back to there was a KYC idea like that you and I chatted about for, you know, I think you went really deep on it, right? Like, I think that was one of the first things that you and Craig were getting really deep on.
Yeah.
And there were lots of meetings, lots of research, tons of like customer development and lots of data and analytics. So I felt like that, you know, coming to, you know, as that process went on, I felt like I was getting more conviction that this is exciting. Like your understanding of the thing felt like stronger than ever, pointed to market signal there. And then in the end, you decided that wasn't the right thing to pursue. And I wonder, what were the core things that were getting you? Was it a personal thing or more a market thing, or what was causing you to lose conviction?
Yeah. There's a bunch of different things involved, right? So turn back the clock. This was maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago or something.
Yeah.
So the KYC AML idea that DK and I discussed had to do with building a new type of KYC product around crypto and using essentially multifactorial authentication, right? What I ended up finding out after essentially researching a bunch of KYC companies is they all primarily use one basic form of identity authentication, right? It might be IDs, it might be like asking a questionnaire, it might be phone number based, but they were like all different. And then one of the things I realized is that like in order to actually accurately verify identity, it's probably best if you take a multifactorial approach, right? And just an intelligent approach, like a approach that can be essentially customized and personalized. By the way, what ended up happening is Rick Song and the folks from Persona ended up building basically this, right? And I think they just recently raised a Series B or something. So, you know, kudos to them. I think they execute on this vision pretty well. A couple of different things, though, were like red flags I had at that point in time. One was my realization that for the KYC space, especially with an initial GTM approach that we were taking, my realization was that it was completely correlated with the price of crypto.
Yeah.
Right. The more folks that ended up essentially wanting to become a crypto customer of Coinbase, the more KYCs they would have to do.
Right.
Right. And I think I had an inkling that the crypto markets were about to crash. This is like 2018, something like that.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And they crashed, I think, 3 to 6 months after. I remember, I think you and I were on WhatsApp. We're like, oh, crypto market crash.
Right.
So that would have like really hurt the GTM, right? But not necessarily killed the company. Another thing I saw was like for things in the KYC AML space, what I had seen in general was that companies were very reluctant to actually purchase that product, right? And have it be kind of effective. Here's what I mean. Like, if you're any kind of institution, you want to do good enough KYC where you don't get slapped with a fine by the government. But you don't want your KYC to be so restrictive that you actually end up axing customers.
Right.
Right. So to a certain extent in KYC AML, you're in this weird space where you don't want to get fined, but you don't want to be so restrictive or potentially so good that you end up actually like, decreasing the number of customers that you let into a specific kind of financial product.
Right.
And that was something that made me take a bit of a pause. Right. And lastly, this is something that I've also thought about and evolved my thinking over time, was in order to actually really build this well, my conclusion is you kind of have to build a compound product. There's the guy that did Zenefits and ended up building a new company after. His name escapes me at the moment. But he recently also wrote something or did a podcast or something about this idea of compound software, which is in the past, you can actually build something that's very, very simple in the software world. And it ended up being valuable and people would adopt it just because it was valuable. But I think what's happening over time was a lot of these like simple software products are being competed away in terms of opportunities to build them, which is like, makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So over time, what you have to build in order to actually build something valuable and like, order of magnitude better is essentially you have to build these compound software products that combine multiple different features. And this is what he did with Rippling. Rippling is his new company, right? And I actually think that's true. I actually think over time, what you might see is there will continue to be software products that end up being value add that are simple, but there will also be an opportunity to build these compound products that actually are interlocking and interworking, but take more effort to actually build and get off the ground. Right.
Yeah, certainly the compound product that you're describing would have fewer kind of competitors or fewer people who are building the bridge between thing A and thing B, because just getting all the parts moving and synthesizing the needs is just, it's just a harder endeavor. It takes more capital, time, talent, etc., around the table to achieve that. So that does seem like it would be under sort of served or underexploited from an opportunity perspective.
Yeah. I think if you wanted to build a really good KYC AML kind of product, one potentially really good way of doing it is building a compound product way, in a way where you are both doing multifactorial kind of authentication across multiple different approaches, as well as multi-country authentication, right? Because one of the big problems in KYC is like actually authenticating a person in US is a very different process than authenticating a person in Japan or Thailand.
I see.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but if you are a product and you're serving an international customer base, it's actually useful to have an international KYC product instead of trying to, hire 50 different products for 50 different countries.
Right.
Right. So going compound software early on something like KYC probably makes a ton of sense. But then it ups essentially the requirements, the time, the capital, the risk as well.
Yeah. How do you think about that compound product hypothesis within kind of your day-to-day work?
So I think if you're building something that's like different, that doesn't exist in a meaningful way right now, that compound software process is less important. Because kind of the differentiation could be the core product itself, but not only the core product, the process by which you came to the decisions and the rationale behind the products, right? Even if you see a product out there that exists, it's almost impossible to one-for-one copy the product perfectly, because what matters isn't just the product, it's actually like the path dependency in terms of how you got to that product, right? So what we're doing in social e-commerce, I think actually is something that people aren't really doing in the US, right? So the need for differentiating in the process of building compound software, I think is like less important.
Okay, so maybe compound software is most important if there's two established categories with established competitors, but you see the gap in how they get bridged. Then the compound software thing lets you rebuild category A and rebuild category B, hopefully nearing best in breed at both. And it's the bridge and the synthesis of them that creates new value.
Yeah.
But in the case of what you're saying, there isn't already kind of an existing player that you're competing with, so you can just go vertical, narrow, focused, whatever you want to call it, and then you can take that to expand out.
Yeah, I agree with that characterization. I also kind of suspect that compound software will probably be more important in B2B.
Yep, that makes sense.
Because kind of what you're doing is you're replacing budget line items. And if it's the same person responsible for two different types of software, and it's like the same budget line item, you can kind of do that B2B sales tactic where you just replace different line items with something that's better or cheaper. And I think that's probably part of what Rippling's doing. Like competing with folks like Gusto and like other types of both HR as well as like, very, very related buckets of software as well.
That makes sense. What was the MVP that you built or were testing out for the idea that you ended up pursuing?
Yeah, so for this specific one, what we ended up doing is a couple of different things. Is we ended up building, prototyping products, and then running ads against them. That is one of the things we ended up doing. We ended up doing a bunch of interviews with, in our case, we work with e-commerce merchants, right? We ended up doing interviews with e-commerce merchants and basically trying to get them to commit to actually buying and using the product. It ended up being something very, very, very meaningful for them. So one of the things we did is we talked to a whole bunch of different e-commerce companies, and we ended up like reverse engineering their income statement, right? So for e-commerce as a whole, this is pretty fascinating. For a lot of D2C brands, what we saw is that if I make $100, of the $100, $15 is COGS, right? A lot lower than I expected. I was like, wow, $15 is COGS. Where is the other money going to, right?
Yeah.
$40, $50 ends up being marketing costs, right? Which blew my mind. I knew it was very, very large, but it was even larger than I expected for a lot of these D2C brands, right?
Yeah, wow.
About $20 ended up being operation costs, right? This is like salaries. This is like shipping. This is like the other things that they need to do to software costs to keep the company running, right? So if you back of the envelope that, you already are at $85 on 100 essentially being taken away by like a lot of these marketing COGS as well as operational costs. And the additional $5, $6 ends up being taken away by a combination of taxes and other maybe like financing type fees, right? So the actual net profit line item for a bunch of e-commerce business is like 10%, right? But of that 10%, the breakdown is the one that we just walked through. So that was another really interesting data point where I was like, man, it's really hard to move COGS costs, right? You need to change supply chain, operations, logistics, sourcing. You can, and if you can do this, it's like very meaningful to a bunch of brands, but it's hard to do. Operation costs, like things like shipping and salaries, I do think there's also opportunities to move them there, right? But if you think about kind of like where such a big portion of this is, the 40, 50% being marketing, that just felt like both like a lion's share of opportunity, as well as a product that our team, being ex-Facebook, ex-Google, from both a combination of social, ad tech, martech, fintech, e-commerce, is pretty well situated to tackle, right? So we feel pretty good about this from like a team market perspective as well.
And so how do you go about the, kind of, I don't know what you describe as the current state. Are you sort of in working with early customers? Are you validating some of the hypotheses while building prototypes? Are you sort of already launched and growing? And kind of what is the sort of stage of these, these ideas coming together kind of embodied? What does it look like today?
So we are live. The product has been whitelisted essentially until now. But we're about to turn on the boosters and start really growing. So
cool. And how do you think, like, what does it mean to turn on the boosters? Does it kind of organically spread within the communities of people who would be candidate customers, or do you imagine there are sort of like educational materials you'll create, or kind of distribution partners or channel partners you might work with, or how do you think about sort of turn on the boosters?
Yeah. The best thing I've ever seen in terms of growth, channel growth, is this thing that, have you heard of this guy named Gabe Weinberg? Founded DuckDuckGo.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He wrote this really cool book called Traction. I just shared it here as well. And what I love about this book is it essentially broke down like 19, almost close to holistic covering of like the major traction channels.
Oh, cool.
And what I've seen actually be really effective is picking the ones that you think will do best for your particular business. And then just going through them and finding probably maybe the small number 2-3 channels that work the best and really leaning into them. That's been our process, going through holistically, thinking about what are the channels that probably we could use, and then really leaning into the ones that we think would work best for us.
Right. That's cool.
That's
I'm gonna take a look
Reminds
at that
me of this
article.
Lenny blog post that we talked to him about once.
Right. Yeah.
Drive growth by picking the right lane. Sort of like chunkier categories than Gabe's, it sounds like, but
yeah. Also, this reminds me, we were offered an intro to Gabe, so we should take that intro up.
You totally
should. Good discussion to have, yeah.
Right.
We talk about this piece and actually DuckDuckGo, it's a fascinating story.
Yeah. If you read the stuff that Gabe has put out over the years, always great, always fascinating. He wrote not only this book about traction, which I've recommended probably to like 100 entrepreneurs, but he also wrote this really good book about like mental models, which I'm a big fan of as well.
By the way, I don't have any inside scoop on DuckDuckGo, but I've watched it as an outsider for quite a while, and I've always been fascinated by this. And I noticed we're actually almost at the hour, so I'm gonna have to wrap in a second. But have you noticed this DuckDuckGo traffic chart?
What? Wow.
This is DuckDuckGo. This is 2010, right? So this is like a long time ago. And look at how, you look at it today and it looks kind of flat during this period. But if you look at the queries, you see that query number keeps changing?
Yeah.
Like it's definitely growing very well. But it's just like, compared to what it's doing today, this looks like it's flat. And now it's just like, actually, you can pop it down, so you can change the day average to like, give me a 7-day average, and you get like a little bit of a messier picture, but it's still quite nice. Then you can, if you want really messy and noisy, you get the 1-day average. But the smooth one is if you look at it on a year-over-year basis, it's just like, wow, this thing is, and this is a search product, right? Like search traffic is like the most valuable kind of product traffic on the internet, and this is like an exponentially growing query product. So
yeah, it's hard to see this because it's plotted out on like a normal curve. I bet you if you ended up looking this on a logarithmic scale, it would be like just a consistent positive pattern.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's what lightning in a bottle is.
Yeah.
And that's 11 years in the making. So it's not, it's definitely, it seems like it's been working even from early days, but it, to get to where it is, that's 11 years of progress.
Yeah.
Or maybe even a little more. I don't know the full story, but anyway, I know we have a hard stop at 1 today, and it's now 1 because we got to pop over to another show. So I wanted to wrap. Thanks, George, for joining us. I hope we do this more soon. This was always great to get together and kind of just jam on ideas and our hypotheses and test them and learn from each other. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, always fun. Always a pleasure. And thank you for having me, guys.
Cool. All right.
Thanks.
See ya.
See ya.